Coming up on this episode, we're talking about human resources, strategy, analytics, the role of AI, and the importance of being proactive. This and so much more as we take another step on the perfect route. Hello and welcome to the show. I've got Heather Mallette with me today. Hello, Heather. How are you?
Good morning. I'm excited to be here.
Excited to have you on the show, too. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I am a native of Cleveland, relocated to Toledo in 1997. I've been in HR for over 20 years and have logistics, HR, healthcare, manufacturing, PE experience. I'm currently the president of Nora, which is the local human resource society, a graduate of the University of Toledo, a proud Rockets fan, and me and my family reside here.
Fantastic. I just moved to Toledo early last year, but I've been visiting for a long time because I've got family here. And we always want to give a shout out to the 419, a great place to live
We love
and
it
work.
here.
Yes, we do. Yes, we
Yes.
do. Thanks for that introduction. And for the viewers and listeners at home, we've got an exciting discussion all about HR coming up. And let's start with your origin story, Heather. What pulled you into the world of human resources?
For me, it was really the intersection of people, business, and performance. And I realized early on how organizations were struggling with strategy, and they fail because people can't execute that strategy consistently. And I saw that early on in my career, that HR was being seen as a support function. And today it's so much different and so much better. We're really part of the ROI in the organization, and that's really a strategic advantage for organizations. The best HR leaders don't just understand policies, they understand operations, growth, capacity, and culture, and they understand that this is how businesses win. And this is really where HR is headed. And then when you look at the executive level, HR is about creating conditions for performance and having the right leaders, the right talent, the right structure, and the right accountability all in place at the same time. And that's an evolution that energizes me. And that's where HR really becomes strategic and where we can really make a difference and have a seat at the table. It's truly the new evolution of HR. And really, in a nutshell, organizations don't fail from just strategy alone. They fail from inconsistent execution. And HR is one of the highest places where ROI can be made in the organization, and the best HR leaders speak both business first and HR second.
Amen. And I'm also a big believer in strategy implementation. You can have the best plan ever, but if your execution falls apart, you're not really going to succeed. Having HR as a strategic business partner is so important for organizations, especially given the challenges we've got for employee retention, and as well as keeping knowledge within the organization. What do you think the human resources function should look like? Who's it's going to support and serve?
HR should serve the organization, the people, and the strategy. I think that's really where HR can execute and make a lasting difference. We need to be ready on all fronts and also have that strategic advantage by using AI. I think that's a new development in HR that is coming up. And really, we have to be on the forefront of how we're going to use HR and even partnering with other parts of the organization in governance.
Okay. Yeah. And using AI has been essential for a few years now, but I think part of it's just the rising expectations of executives and investors that AI get integrated into not only the planning, but the day-to-day work of organizations. And that has hit HR, squarely we're squarely in the target now. What's a recent initiative you think that captures the strategic potential of human resources?
There's so many, but if I had to narrow it down, I would say there's so much potential in executive thinking and even as a strategic partner and processing judgment there that we really haven't observed or absorbed the real function that we can do. Because really, everyone, I shouldn't say everyone, or most organizations are doing, I'll call it surface level HR AI. They're reading emails, they're helping with maybe a strategy or a recruiting plan, but they're not necessarily implementing it as a thought partner or pressure testing their ideas against it or using it as devil's advocate. And I really think that's an area
Mhm.
where the business could potentially see some advantages versus their competitors.
I like the devil's advocate approach, and I've used it myself with AI. One of my favorite things to do with Claude and ChatGPT and some of the other LLMs is have it ask me questions and throw up roadblocks that make me think, right, rather than just me making instructions and prompting and see what I get. The devil's advocate approach can be super helpful, especially in a discipline like HR, where we're dealing with people and they're going to have different opinions sometimes than our professional judgment on what should happen.
Correct.
And, part of our role is to communicate how and why things are progressing the way they are. Speaking of communication, I see that as one of the big gaps in HR. It's a constant challenge, but are there other gaps or underdeveloped areas that you can think of and comment about with HR?
Absolutely. One of the biggest gaps I see is that many HR teams are still measuring impact or I'm sorry, they're measuring activity instead of impact. And we see
Hmm.
so many trainings and so many positions that are filled by executives that care about outcomes, but we're not improving any retention. We're not looking at our leaders getting stronger? Is the organization actually healthier? Another major gap is workforce planning. And this is an area we're all feeling right now. Too many organizations are still operating reactively instead of strategically. And organizations that are winning right now are planning talent in the same way they plan revenue growth and operation strategy. And more
Interesting.
HR has to be,
Yeah.
yeah. One other point I'd like to make is that HR
Yeah.
has to get more comfortable with making business decisions and
Mm.
being more strategic because we have to be a partner at the table. And sometimes HR confuses being busy with being strategic, and those are not the same thing. And
Oh, no.
activity without impact is an expense.
It is. Being busy for busy's sake or, just falling into firefighting mode robs us of the opportunities to be proactive and strategic in what we're doing, especially now, because given the economic and market landscapes that companies are facing, it's helpful to have some multiple alternatives so that you're not puzzling your way through what to do when something suddenly shifts, like tariffs or immigration policy.
And I think you see that the best organizations plan talent before they need it, to add to your
Mhm.
point, and that we need with the strategy to have accountability and not just empathy. Because although the empathy is important, if there's no strategy or accountability tied to any of those things, we're not really measuring anything or making an impact and doing what we're meant to do and push the
All right.
business forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, Speaking of measuring and pushing the business forward, what kind of metrics or signals do you think matter most, especially to executive teams?
Well, I know most HR teams are measuring I'll call it the traditional HR metrics, which would be retention, engagement, turnover, leadership effectiveness. But the real value comes from connecting those metrics to operations and financial outcomes. And that's where HR becomes that business partner and gets that seat at the table. Turnover alone isn't going to tell the story. We want to know who's leaving, why are they leaving? Is it under a certain leader? Is it affecting growth of a customer experience? What actually is going on? Those are the real questions we need to be asking. We also want to pay
Mhm.
attention to leading indicators of health of organizations around different corners, which means like the engagement trends, manager effectiveness, early turnover, internal mobility, and this will help predict the future performance of the organization, and the financials will catch up to that. But if we can be on the early end of the early part of this, it's going to make all the difference. And if you can't connect those metrics to the business, then it's probably just noise. And that's how
Yeah.
HR earns their credibility and builds that business impact through those
Mhm.
leading indicators. And I think that's one area where HR hasn't really shown up and where we can and where we're going to make a big difference.
Yeah, having those leading indicators is so valuable. And not just from the sense of being able to say, well, told you this was coming. It gives you the opportunity to actually plan some alternatives. So if these leading indicators actually come to pass, then you've got plans ready. You've got a direction forward instead of improvising, like we mentioned a little bit earlier. What about leadership? What are companies trying to do in terms of building leadership capabilities?
Leaders are really leading under uncertain times now. We know everything is changing so quickly. Employees really struggle when there's uncertainty, and it's when leadership can show up that and make some clarity in uncertain times that make the difference. So that means having business acumen, emotional intelligence. They communicate clearly. They make decisions decisively. They build trust with their team. They develop talent. They stay steady under pressure. And we know that there's a lot of pressure in the marketplace right now. HR's role in this is to define how great leadership, what it actually looks like. Building great systems, helping with coaching, looking at succession planning, developing feedback and accountability for everybody. Leadership can't do this alone. In a classroom alone, and providing a yearly training isn't going to be enough to push leadership in the right direction. Mm-hmm. It's built through real challenges, coaching, real opportunities, stretch projects, and honest feedback. And the best leaders happen sometimes out of chaos, unfortunately, or being put into real life situations. And again, employees can survive uncertainty, but they cannot survive inconsistency. And that really is where leaders really need to be consistent and fair.
Yeah, I agree. And, especially about not only consistency, but having, leadership development programs that are evergreen. They keep going, and they just don't run in annual or quarterly fits and starts based on, okay, what events can we squeeze into the schedule now that we've got it made? People have leadership problems every day, and part of our job in human resources and in corporate learning is to make sure that they've got the resources and knowledge available when they've got the questions.
Right. And I think it's also sometimes HR can be very, well, we have X number of trainings we need to do. It's not just checking that box. It's actually what impact are we making and how are we developing this person so that we can have that bench strength when we need it, going back to some of the other questions to have that talent ready to go when needed.
Yeah. Succession planning is becoming even more crucial. I've seen organizations get themselves into a jam over the last year because they didn't have a succession plan in place. And, in one case, the organization was downsizing, but they didn't readily understand who was going to pick up the extra work. In other cases, people are still finding jobs and leaving organizations. And, it's not good to get caught flat-footed in those situations. Yeah. Well, let's talk about what the human resources function ought to look like. We've already talked a little bit about leadership development training and how that should be engaging and relevant and available. But what about human resources? How do we make sure it's engaging, relevant, and available across all the different levels, teams, and functional areas in an organization?
First and foremost, HR has to be more strategic. We have to be focused more on data, technology, and also in line with that is also the human aspect, because it can't just be all the data and numbers. There's a human aspect of it. And AI is an intricate part of this with the automation. It will reduce some of the administrative work, which will allow human resources to do the work that really matters the most. And we won't win just with the technology alone, but with the human aspect. The technology is going to create better leadership capacity and better decision making for those who use it correctly. And unfortunately, for those who don't, they might be left behind. And we're going to see major growth in work analytics, AI-enabled tools, skill-based hiring, personalized learning, and predictive workforce planning. The future of HR is not less human, and I want to emphasize that. It's more human with better tools. And AI should automate a lot of these things for us and really make it easier to do our job. It's one more tool in our toolbox that we're using to help push that strategic piece.
And, that is an opportunity for HR groups to, automate or let go of legacy processes that don't make a lot of sense. I'm thinking of one particular example with regular I-9 audits, which sometimes didn't happen until somebody was coming in to do the external audit, and they realized, we've fallen off cadence with our internal audit of I-9 data. And that's just one example. There's compliance, which I always felt that compliance should be regarded in a proactive way rather than reactive and say, well, we've got to get everybody through the gender discrimination training by X date, rather than saying, okay, here's a regular appointment, and it's part of what we're doing each week to help our organizational team members progress and develop. And while we can automate that with technology, we still need that strategic viewpoint that you pointed out.
And I think, too, one other point should be that technology creates capacity for better leadership. I think that's not discussed enough. And that's really a valid point that is being left out of the conversation that is so relevant right now.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because, while we assume that technology is going to create capacity, we don't necessarily recognize that technology helps create capacity not only for better leadership, but for more strategic thought in what we're doing. It's easier to read the road ahead of you when the car is sort of driving itself. And with the AI technology, with agentic AI, we've got more of an opportunity to get to that point. Now, I've had students and coworkers and teammates react badly when I talk about AI and automation, and they think, oh, we're trying to replace people, and instead of we're trying to free up their time so that they can do something more valuable.
And I think
Do you
that's
run
really
into
the
that
lens where
sentiment
we
at
have
all?
to come. Yeah, I would say that's the lens that we have to come from. And that's how
Yeah.
I've reframed it in conversations, because you're right. It's a scary thing, because in the headlines you're seeing all the time, and our employees are too, that AI is going to eliminate X number of jobs, or this job won't be a future job, or this job. But really, it's not that. It may be in some instances, but in a lot of cases, it's going to be used in a different way, or your job is going to evolve just like any other job has evolved over time. And so I think it's reshaping the conversation and just refocusing the lens slightly where it makes the difference for employees. And when they stop and think about it from that perspective, it's a little less scary, because, people are trying to sell headlines in newspapers and news stories.
Yeah, and fear, uncertainty, and doubt can often drive people's attention. But, we've been through some startling technology changes in the last 30 years. The dot-com era, Web 2.0. I'm old enough to remember when PCs started coming into the organization, and we thought we're going to be able to eliminate so many jobs and so much paper usage with PCs, and neither one of those was true. I think organizations are using more paper than ever now. But, it's definitely a concern for me that, employees are struggling to accept and engage with advanced technology when there's value that they could find with doing so.
And I think that really comes down to finding champions who want to embrace that technology and get them on your side, or get them using the technology. And then it becomes a little less scary. Of course, we have our guardrails in place and certain policies and procedures. But if we can get a couple early adopters in different groups working on things, I think it shows the team that this is a valuable tool. And when they can see, here's the things I've done with my workflow, or I've integrated it in these ways into my daily work life, and it hasn't interrupted my life in negative ways, that I think we see a lot of value. And I know even with some of my employees, they're doing things like that, and it's really helped. I do have several that are adverse to AI, so we're taking steps to get them in the right direction. But I want to start with those early adopters and get them on my side, and get our processes and procedures in place. So when we have those that we might have to give a little bit more attention to, we have that bandwidth, because we have the group that's already up and running and very comfortable.
Yeah. And that's a good model that's worked before with some of the technologies I mentioned earlier. Perhaps some of the difference with AI is that perception that AI is taking away work and taking away opportunities to look valuable, when I think the opposite is true. AI is creating more opportunities for employees to be valuable.
And I think it really comes down to, with some of that, the valuable piece is what is driving that fear, right? Where is it coming from, and how do we address that too? Because that's another interesting point with this. If we can get to what is the root cause, maybe we can move beyond it a little bit faster.
Yeah. Some of it is rumor and you talk with a friend who works at another organization whose AI or technology implementation has gone badly, then that plants seeds of doubt. And I do find it interesting just how people assume that technology rollouts are going to fail.
Yeah, that's been my
Having
experience as well.
Yeah, yeah, and it's instead of working towards the positive and working towards success, we just sort of roll our eyes and go, "Oh, let's wait for the other shoe to drop."
Right.
And it almost creates that self-fulfilling prophecy of failure. Well, let's turn away from technology for a couple moments and talk about the fun of mandatory training, which we mentioned a little bit earlier. How do we get people engaged in mandatory training, but do it in a way that makes them curious and want to actually do it themselves?
I think it has to be engaging and they have to be able to see the value in it. And that really comes down to appealing to the different types of learners. And now with our workforce, we have multiple generations in the workforce. So how are we going to appeal to those different learners? So I usually look at those pieces first. Who is my audience? What is the material we're going to cover? And then how can we do this in a way that isn't just checking a box? Because everybody's been to a training where it's a in or quotations mandatory training where they have a PowerPoint and they click through it. 30 slides later, they've read every piece of every bulleted point, explained every character on the slide, and then sign this form and leave. We've all had that, and we know that is not good. That does not help with
Right.
retention.
Oh, yeah.
That does not do any of those things. So to move beyond that, I think we have to look at different approaches. Sometimes that might mean doing more of a discussion with some questions in a group setting when we can. In some settings, like in manufacturing where I'm currently employed, we can't always do that. So maybe that's doing some web training where there's interactive questions in there where they can have some of that training, and then also doing some live trainings for those that might not want to do web training. Is there a way that we could have kind of a hybrid approach? So it sort of depends on each environment on what makes the most sense and where do we meet our employees.
Yeah, that's something definitely to consider about where do we meet the employees in terms of their needs, expectations, and preferences, especially in terms of how we can engage them better. Mandatory training has this bad rap in business, and making it something that people look forward to almost as an appointment for learning is really one of my goals, rather than saying, well, you got to show up at 9:30 and we're going to talk about X, Y, and Z. And as you put it, check the box. And hopefully we'll do a better job of that as the future goes along. Speaking of the future, what do you think the next 3 to 5 years in HR are going to look like for businesses?
I think it's an exciting time in HR. I think we're going to see an increase in the amount of technology that's being used. Our leaders are going to be pushed to be more strategically focused, more employee focused, and more results driven, which is going to lead to having to come up with better systems, better processes, more engaging cultures, that more flexibility or creativity in work, because there's the new technologies are going to require that. And with the workforce shifting and changing and their preferences changing, that means we're going to have to adapt and figure out ways to meet our employees where they are and meet our business needs at the same time, which is an interesting conversation in itself.
Yeah, and it, as we've talked about during the last half hour, the technology is a moving target. What our employees want in terms of work-life balance has become something of a moving target as well. And being able to meet the needs of our employees and managers while balancing that with what the organization needs has become even trickier now than I think it's ever been. But it is an exciting time to be in HR, especially when we love challenges like this. They're just opportunities for improvement as far as I'm concerned. Well, let's say you had the opportunity to blow everything up in HR and start from scratch. What would Heather's version of HR look like?
Are you sure you want to hear this? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, sure.
I'm just kidding. If I had the chance to redesign from scratch, I'd build on business execution and not just
Okay.
legacy process. I'd also look at the HR function. Is it too complex? Are there too many layers to things? Is there too many disconnects? Too many slow processes that we could improve upon with those disconnects? I'd also focus on operational excellence, strategic partnership, workforce intelligence, and leadership capability. The employee HR experience should be simple, responsive, and useful. And leaders should see HR as a business partner and accelerating the business. And HR should be able to execute on the strategic points of the business and be seen as that strategic partner. And that's the advantage, while also understanding the human component of things. And what we don't want to choose between performance and people. We need to see how both are connected. And that's really where the execution is going to come from. And really, in the end, often complexity is the enemy of execution. And the best organizations connect performance and people. And really, great HR is both disciplined and deeply human. And one last question I have on this matter is, where do we really think HR is headed, right? Not only what should they
Right.
be doing, but where are they headed and how do we get there?
Right. Setting up not only the organization, but the HR function for success as we go through not only these technology changes, but the changes in societal preferences on how we engage with organizations. We're seeing more and more people leave organizations to do gig work, to be entrepreneurs, especially as the economy has changed and different kinds of opportunities have popped up. I've hit periods of my life where I was working and balancing 3 jobs. Now I've basically got 1 job being a solopreneur, and I love it. But you've got a great point about how HR needs to be more agile, better informed, and as we've mentioned a few times in the last half hour, more proactive rather than, what we used to think of as the personnel department, doing lots of manual processes, compiling lists, and coming in after the fact to figure out what happened instead of trying to make sure that these situations don't happen and that we have opportunities to improve rather than problems we have to fix.
Yep. And I'd also say too, to your point, that HR should be the accelerator of the business and not slow it down is really,
Okay.
the point here. And that the other point being that great HR is both disciplined and human. Again, I like to tie those back because I think when we become robotic, that's when, or again, checking a box is not the answer here. That's where the real gold is in HR.
I love the way that you package disciplined and human at the same time, because we've got to treat people consistently, but we need to be nice about it too, and kind. People remember how you made them feel, especially if you made them feel bad. But kindness is a laudable goal to have for not only any organization, but for HR as well, because people take those interactions with HR so personally sometimes.
Agreed.
Any closing thoughts for us? Questions that have been lingering in your mind, or things you want to pass along to our listeners and viewers?
I would say that this is one of the best times to be in HR and that we're all lucky to be part of it. But I think there's one last question we need to ask. What's the one thing that HR leaders are still getting wrong? What do you think?
For me, it's holding to assumptions that don't make sense, holding on to workflows that could be eliminated or optimized so that, management isn't waiting for data analytics, employees aren't waiting for pieces that they need. As far as the employee is concerned, they don't care that there's a lot of people in the queue for processing benefits changes. They just know, okay, I put mine in on the 23rd, it's the 28th now. Why isn't this changed? Even simple stuff like name and address changes. So for me, what HR leaders are still getting wrong, it's not only those assumptions, but it's those opportunities for improvement that are just necessary in a function that's supposed to support and add value to the organization.
But I agree.
Thank you. And great talking with you today, Heather. If people want to look for you, is LinkedIn a good spot to do that? Or
Yep.
okay,
They can find me on LinkedIn under Heather Mallette. Also on Instagram at Hey, it's Heather M, and on Facebook at Heather Mallette.
awesome. I love that Instagram handle. That's a good one. So listeners and viewers out there, make sure you connect with Heather and look for another episode coming up as we take another step on the perfect route.